Winston Churchill. That name is etched deep in history as one of the most resilient and profoundly influential leaders Britain has ever produced. In the darkest hour of the 20th century, as Europe fell one by one under Adolf Hitler's advance, he rose as the symbol of unyielding resistance. As Prime Minister, Churchill not only led a nation under threat of invasion, he also instilled in the entire people a belief that freedom was still worth fighting for to the end. His speeches, powerful, decisive, full of emotion, became spiritual weapons, sustaining the will of the British people through the long nights of the Blitz. He was the architect of key alliances with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, helping shape the course of World War II and paving the way for the final victory over Nazi Germany. Beyond being a statesman, Churchill was an outstanding writer who received the Nobel Prize in Literature, leaving his mark through his expressive ability and sharp historical insight. From someone once doubted and isolated, he became a global symbol of will, steadfastness, and the belief that even in the most desperate moments, people can still rise against history. But behind the image of a hero lies a life full of cracks that few see. Churchill grew up in the emotional coldness of his parents, carrying a sense of abandonment that lingered through his childhood, a quiet loneliness that never fully disappeared. Political failures, especially the disaster of the Gallipoli campaign, forced him to confront the collapse of his reputation and self-doubt. He called his bouts of depression his black dog, a darkness always lurking, dragging him into profound despair. The pressures of war came not only from external enemies, but also from life-and-death decisions, where every choice could lead to the deaths of thousands. During the nights when London was engulfed in bombs and fire, as he appeared before the public with an unflinching exterior, few knew that inside was a man wrestling with fear, with crushing responsibility, and with the question that never had an answer: was he leading his country to victory or to ruin? If you want to explore how a boy seen as a failure became the one man standing alone against history itself, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. If war turned Winston Churchill into a symbol of resilience, then his early years tell a completely different story. The story of a boy whom almost no one believed in. He was born in 1874 at Blenheim Palace, one of Britain's most magnificent aristocratic residences, belonging to the prestigious Marlborough family. In terms of background, Churchill had every advantage to become a perfect gentleman of Britain's upper class. But reality took a different path. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a famous but cold, stern politician who showed almost no interest in his son. He had high expectations but little patience for Winston's weaknesses. Every time Churchill failed in his studies, his father's response was not encouragement, but disappointment and criticism. On his mother's side, Jenny Jerome was a prominent woman in London's high society, busy with social connections and largely absent from raising her child. Winston grew up in a home full of material comforts, but lacking basic emotional bonds. The greatest influence on his childhood was not his parents, but his nanny, Elizabeth Everest, the person Churchill later always mentioned with deep gratitude. She was the one who cared for him, taught him, and gave him the sense of being valued that he never received from his blood family. In his education, Churchill was not an outstanding student. He struggled with traditional subjects, especially Latin and mathematics, and was often seen as slow compared to his peers. At boarding schools, he was repeatedly placed in weaker groups, even considered undisciplined and hard to mold. These negative judgments came not only from teachers, but were reinforced by his own father, who believed Winston would achieve little in life. In a famous letter, Lord Randolph once wrote that his son might amount to nothing. Such assessments left a deep mark on Churchill's psyche, forming a mix of inferiority and defiance. He refused to be defined by failure, yet he had no clear path to prove otherwise. It was during this period that a key trait began to form: the need for recognition. Churchill didn't just want success. He wanted success in a way that could not be denied. When traditional academic paths didn't fit, he turned to the military, a practical choice with opportunity. Even this path wasn't easy. He had to take the entrance exam multiple times before passing into the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and he was only accepted into the cavalry, a branch often for lower-scoring cadets. But instead of seeing it as failure, Churchill saw opportunity. Cavalry meant frontline action, where he could build a reputation quickly. What's remarkable is that instead of being weakened by isolation and emotional deprivation, Churchill seemed to develop a strong psychological independence. He learned not to depend on others' approval while still craving it. This combination created a unique drive, both needing to prove himself and refusing to be limited by external judgments. In later years, when he stood alone in major political decisions, this trait became crucial. But at that childhood point, it was just a survival response, a way for a boy to face a world that didn't fully welcome him. Looking back, Churchill's childhood was not a story of privilege, but of disconnection in a wealthy environment. He wasn't a child expected to become great. On the contrary, he grew up amid skepticism, negative evaluations, and the feeling that he had to carve his own place in the world. Paradoxically, that very isolation became the foundation for his later ability to stand firm alone. When all of Europe turned its back on his warnings, when colleagues distrusted him, Churchill was already accustomed to it long before the war began. And that's why the boy no one believed in became the one ready to believe in himself when no one else would. From a boy undervalued in school, Winston Churchill entered adulthood with a clear choice. If he couldn't prove himself in the classroom, he would do it on the battlefield. After several failed attempts, he was finally accepted into the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst and graduated in 1894. Being assigned to the cavalry was not just an academic compromise, but opened the opportunity Churchill truly sought: war. Unlike many young officers, he didn't wait for chances to come to him. He actively pursued them. In 1895, he went to Cuba as both a military observer and a war correspondent, covering the rebellion against Spain. This was the first time Churchill combined two roles, soldier and journalist, a strategy he quickly realized could bring him far more than just combat experience. After Cuba, Churchill continued to be deployed to India, where he served in the British Army in the northwest frontier region. There, he not only participated in military campaigns, but also began writing his first articles and books, recording his experiences. These works were not merely narrative. They also showed a clear ambition to build a name for himself. Churchill understood that in British society at that time, military achievements could bring fame, but it was the ability to tell the story that turned fame into lasting capital. He wrote not just to document events, but to shape how others perceived him. In 1898, Churchill took part in the campaign in Sudan under General Kitchener's command, where he was present at the Battle of Omdurman, one of the last major battles of the colonial warfare era. There he fought directly while continuing to send dispatches back to Britain. This experience reinforced an emerging belief that war was not only a place to fight, but also a stage to build a personal image. However, the real turning point in this period came in 1899, when Churchill went to South Africa to report on the Second Boer War. During a journey with an armored train, Churchill was ambushed and captured by the Boers. The fact that a war correspondent fell into enemy hands quickly became big news in Britain. But it was what happened next that turned him into a household name across the nation. Churchill carried out a daring escape from the prison camp, traveling hundreds of miles through enemy territory to reach safety. The story spread rapidly, was exploited by the press, and propelled Churchill from an obscure officer to a public figure. He wasn't just a survivor. He was someone who knew how to turn survival into a story. After returning to Britain, Churchill made the most of his newfound fame. He published books, gave public lectures, and built his image as a man of action, someone who had truly experienced war. More importantly, he began to grasp a principle that would later shape his entire career. Reputation is not just the result of action, but a tool to achieve power. In a political system where public attention could be converted into influence, Churchill realized he held an advantage not everyone had. Churchill's decision to enter politics was not a sudden shift, but the next step in a strategy already forming. He ran for Parliament for the first time in 1899, but lost. However, unlike what had happened in his studies, this time he didn't stop. With his growing fame from the Boer War, he ran again and won the election in 1900, becoming a member of Parliament at just 25 years old. This was not only a personal milestone, but also confirmation that the path he had chosen, combining action, media, and ambition, was beginning to pay off. Looking back on this period, it's clear that Churchill was not simply a soldier or a journalist, but an individual actively constructing his place in society. He didn't wait for opportunities, he created them. He didn't just participate in events, he controlled how those events were told. And most importantly, he understood that to have influence in the political world, one must first become a name that others cannot ignore. These lessons about reputation, about power, and about how to use both would stay with him for the rest of his life, especially when he faced far greater challenges in the years to come. Victory in the 1900 election not only marked the beginning of Winston Churchill's career in politics, but also opened a period of rapid advancement, full of risks. At 25, he became one of the youngest MPs in the British Parliament, bringing with him fame from the battlefield and public attention. However, right from the early years, Churchill showed he was no conventional politician. Instead of following the Conservative Party line, where he began his career, he repeatedly displayed independent views, ready to criticize even those in his own party. This quickly made him a controversial figure. To many, Churchill was a bold young talent, but to plenty of others he was unpredictable, undisciplined, and unreliable. The major turning point came when Churchill decided to leave the Conservative Party and join the Liberal Party in 1904. In the political context of Britain at that time, crossing the floor was not just a strategic choice, but was seen as an act of betrayal. The decision cost him the support of many old allies and branded him as disloyal. However, for Churchill, it was a necessary move. He believed the Liberal Party's policies aligned better with his views, especially on free trade and social reform. But notably, beneath the political reasons, there was a clear personal factor. Churchill always prioritized the path that would take him further, even if it meant accepting risks to his reputation. After joining the Liberals, Churchill's career didn't stall, it accelerated. He was quickly appointed to key government positions. In 1908, he became President of the Board of Trade and later Home Secretary. By 1911, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, head of the Royal Navy, one of the most powerful positions in the British government. These promotions happened in a relatively short time, reinforcing Churchill's image as a rising star in politics. He not only had strong oratorical skills, but also showed decisiveness in pushing reforms, especially in military and industrial fields. During the same period, another important element appeared in Churchill's life: his marriage to Clementine Churchill in 1908. Unlike many of his previous social relationships, Clementine was not just a spouse, but also a stable emotional anchor in his turbulent life. She did not hesitate to point out weaknesses in his character, especially his tendency toward impulsiveness and lack of restraint. In many critical moments, Clementine acted as a balancing force, helping him reconsider his decisions. However, her presence could not fully control Churchill's nature, a man always driven by ambition and a powerful belief in himself. This personality was both an advantage and a risk. Churchill had no hesitation in making bold decisions, especially in modernizing the British Navy in the face of the threat from Germany. He supported the switch from coal to oil, pushed for the construction of modern warships, and prepared for a conflict that many at the time still did not see as inevitable. These decisions demonstrated his strategic vision, but at the same time they increased suspicion from those who believed he was acting too quickly, too aggressively, and without considering the risks enough. The biggest problem was not that Churchill lacked ability, but that he often ran ahead of his time. He saw threats earlier than others, but the way he acted, direct, forceful, and sometimes impatient, made him prone to backlash. In a political environment where compromise and the balance of power were key elements, Churchill's style made him both noticed and isolated. By the time before World War I, Churchill had reached a position that many people would take a lifetime to achieve. But that very speed of advancement also created an underlying pressure. Expectations grew higher, and mistakes became harder to accept. Each of his decisions no longer affected only his personal career, but impacted the entire nation. In that context, the line between boldness and recklessness became thinner than ever. Looking back on this period, a clear pattern was emerging in Churchill's life. Success came quickly, but it was unstable. Reputation rose high, but it came with doubt. He became one of the most important figures in the British government, but at the same time one of the most controversial. And when a person like that held great power, the question was no longer whether he could succeed, but when a wrong decision would happen, and how great its cost would be. When World War I broke out in 1914, Winston Churchill was in a high position of power as First Lord of the Admiralty, directly responsible for the Royal Navy. As the war quickly fell into stalemate on the Western Front, he began searching for a breakthrough solution to change the situation. Churchill's idea focused on opening a new front at the Dardanelles Strait, attacking the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, to open a supply route to Russia and put pressure on the Central Powers from the south. This plan later became the Gallipoli Campaign, an operation expected to deliver a swift strategic victory for the Allies. Initially, the campaign was launched as a naval attack, but when it failed to break through the Ottoman defenses, it quickly turned into a large-scale amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula. What Churchill and many others underestimated was the Ottoman forces' resistance capability, as well as the rugged terrain and the enemy's thorough preparations. British, Australian, and New Zealand troops who set foot on the shore faced intense fire, harsh conditions, and a prolonged stalemate. Instead of a quick victory, Gallipoli became a brutal war of attrition, with tens of thousands of casualties and no significant strategic gains achieved. As news of the failure spread, political pressure in London mounted rapidly. Parliament, the press, and the public began looking for someone to blame. Although the decision to launch the campaign resulted from many factors and many individuals, Churchill, as its strongest advocate, quickly became the focal point of criticism. He was accused of misjudging the situation, acting too hastily, and sending thousands of soldiers into an operation with no clear chance of success. In a political system where responsibility needed to be clearly assigned, Churchill became the name tied to the failure. The consequences came swiftly. He was forced to resign from the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, a severe blow to his rising career. From one of the most powerful figures in the government, Churchill was pushed to the sidelines, losing the influence and trust he had built over many years. His political reputation collapsed almost completely. Those who had doubted him before now had even more reason to confirm their views. In the eyes of many, Churchill was no longer a bold leader, but a reckless politician who had caused one of Britain's most serious failures in the war. Parallel to the political collapse was a profound personal crisis. Churchill began experiencing bouts of depression that he called his black dog, a heavy, prolonged mental state that left him feeling lost and doubting himself. This was not the first time he had faced this feeling, but this time it became more pronounced, tied to a public and undeniable failure. What had once been strong self-confidence was now replaced by silence and introspection. The pressure came not only from outside but also from within, from the question of whether he was truly suited for leadership. In those circumstances, Churchill made an unusual decision for a politician in his position. He left London and joined the army as an officer. He was appointed commander of a battalion on the Western Front, directly participating in trench warfare. This decision was not only symbolic, but also a way for him to confront the consequences of his previous choices. Instead of staying in the political environment where he was criticized, Churchill chose to return to the battlefield, where risks were real, and where he could regain a sense of control. His time at the front did not erase what had happened at Gallipoli, but it gave Churchill a different perspective. He was no longer making decisions from afar, but directly witnessing the consequences of war. This experience not only influenced how he viewed military matters, but also affected how he handled pressure and responsibility in the years that followed. However, at that moment, what was clear was that his career had been seriously interrupted, and the path back to power, if there was one, would no longer be as easy as before. What had once been a rapid rise was now replaced by silence and waiting. Churchill was no longer at the center of power, no longer shaping policy, but an individual trying to recover from a major failure. But it was during this period that a crucial trait began to form: the ability to endure failure without abandoning ambition. This, though not yet obvious at the time, would become one of the defining characteristics of Churchill in the years to come. The failure at the Gallipoli campaign not only interrupted Winston Churchill's career, but also pushed him into a period of directly confronting himself. When he left his position of power and temporarily withdrew from the center of politics, he was no longer surrounded by debates or public pressure. But that did not mean peace. Instead, suppressed thoughts began to surface more clearly. Churchill had long called his depressive state his black dog, a simple but accurate image to describe the heavy, prolonged, and hard-to-control feeling he had to face. After Gallipoli, the black dog was no longer a fleeting phenomenon, but became a distinct part of his mental life. In periods not consumed by work, Churchill easily fell into negative rumination. He doubted his decisions, his leadership ability, and his own future. These thoughts were not always expressed outwardly, but they influenced how he reacted to the world around him. Along with that, his habit of using alcohol, which had existed before, became more evident. Churchill frequently drank throughout the day, not as an act of losing control, but as a way to maintain a stable mental state. For him, alcohol was not indulgence but a tool, though its effectiveness was always temporary. One of the most noticeable changes in this period was Churchill turning to painting. He began painting as a personal activity, initially just experimental, but it quickly became a method to escape psychological pressure. When painting, Churchill could fully focus on colors, light, and composition, temporarily stepping away from complex thoughts about politics and failure. Painting did not solve problems, but it created a space where he could control something, an important factor for someone who had just experienced a sense of loss of control in his career. Over time, painting became a habit, an indispensable part of how he maintained inner balance. In his personal life, Clementine Churchill played an increasingly important role. She was not just a spouse, but also an observer and adjuster of Churchill's behaviors when necessary. Clementine had the ability to clearly see the weaknesses in his character, his impulsiveness, tendency to speak too bluntly, and sometimes lack of patience, and did not hesitate to offer comments. Their relationship was not always smooth, but it was stable and realistic. In many cases, Clementine helped Churchill avoid impulsive reactions that could further damage his image, especially during the period when he was trying to recover his political position. However, Clementine's presence could not completely eliminate the fluctuations in Churchill's emotions. He still had outbursts, strong reactions to pressure or criticism. Those working closely with him noticed that Churchill could shift from high focus to irritability in a short time. This reflected a consistent trait. He was a person with great energy, but that energy was not always fully controlled. In a political context, this trait could become an advantage, but in personal life, it created tension and distance. Churchill's inner world in this period could be described as a constant tug-of-war between two states. On one hand, he still believed in his abilities and kept the ambition to return to the center of power. On the other hand, memories of failure and criticism made him unable to be completely certain. Confidence and doubt coexisted, not cancelling each other out but creating a form of internal tension. This was not weakness but a more complex form of self-awareness and recognition of his own limits. While the outside world continued to change, Churchill went through a period where the main conflict was no longer between him and political opponents, but within himself. There were no military campaigns, no major speeches, no national-level decisions, only repeated days where he had to maintain balance between action and thought. This was a different kind of challenge, less visible but no less important: the ability to face himself, to stay active without recognition, and not to let previous failure define his entire being. These elements began to shape how Churchill would respond when opportunities to return appeared. This period brought no fame or power, but it created a different foundation. Churchill was no longer someone relying only on initial confidence, but someone who had gone through failure, understood risk more clearly, and learned to live with inner uncertainties. When facing greater challenges in the future, what he learned in this time would not appear as theory, but as reflex: how he stayed calm, how he endured pressure, and how he continued to act even when uncertain of the outcome. After a time away from the center of power and going through personal upheavals, Winston Churchill gradually returned to British politics in the final phase of World War I. This return did not happen suddenly or completely, but step by step, cautiously, in a context where he still carried the shadow of the failure of the Gallipoli campaign. In 1917, he was appointed Minister of Munitions, an important position in the effort to maintain Britain's weapon production capacity during the war. This was an opportunity for Churchill to prove that he could still contribute effectively in technical and organizational roles rather than the high-level strategic decisions that had previously caused controversy. In his new role, Churchill focused on improving industrial production and ensuring a stable supply of weapons for the army. He adopted a more pragmatic, less flamboyant approach than before, and achieved concrete results. Success in this field helped him gradually restore some of his lost credibility. However, this recovery did not mean that public and colleague trust was fully restored. Memories of Gallipoli remained present, and for many, Churchill was still a figure to be watched carefully. After the war, he continued to hold other important positions in the government, including Secretary of State for War and Air, as well as Secretary of State for the Colonies. In these roles, Churchill was involved in decisions that had major impacts on Britain's domestic and foreign policy. He supported intervention in the Russian Civil War to oppose the Bolshevik forces, a decision controversial both strategically and ethically. At the same time, in managing colonial territories, he was involved in policies in the Middle East, including the use of harsh military measures to maintain British control. These decisions reflected a consistent viewpoint. Churchill believed in the power of the state and was ready to use it to achieve objectives. By 1924, Churchill returned to the Conservative Party and was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister. This was one of the most important positions in the government, and his assignment to this role showed a significant degree of political recovery. However, his tenure in this position also came with controversial decisions, especially the return of Britain to the gold standard. This decision, aimed at stabilizing the pound and restoring the nation's financial standing, was criticized by many economists and politicians for increasing pressure on the economy and workers. Once again, Churchill demonstrated his willingness to make principled choices, even when their consequences were not widely agreed upon. Throughout this period, Churchill's image underwent a clear change, but not entirely in a positive direction. He was no longer a young, ambitious politician, but an experienced figure who had gone through failure and come back. However, along with that experience came a complex reputation. To some, he was a capable man, daring to act and unafraid to make tough decisions. To others, he remained an unpredictable figure, prone to acting too quickly and not always fully considering the consequences. Churchill's personality in this period continued to show boldness, but it also came with instability in how he was perceived. He could shift from an effective managerial role to a controversial decision in a short time. This created a constant tension in his career. Every step forward carried the risk of reviving old doubts. Churchill's return was therefore never entirely secure. He always had to operate in an environment where trust in him was conditional and could change at any moment. For Churchill himself, this period was a process of balancing the reformation of his position while avoiding repeating past mistakes. He did not abandon his decisive style, but he began to recognize more clearly the consequences of his choices. However, this adjustment did not erase his essential nature. Churchill remained someone ready to go against the common view if he believed he was right. This very trait, while making him stand out, also continued to place him on the margins at many points. Churchill's post-war career was therefore two-sided. On one hand, he had proven he could come back from failure and continue playing an important role in government. On the other hand, he never fully escaped the image of a controversial politician. Trust in him was unstable, and every new decision could become the starting point for another cycle of doubt. In that context, Churchill was not someone fully rehabilitated, but someone existing between two states, needed but not completely trusted. This very state would become especially important when the world entered a new period of instability. where the qualities that once made him doubted became what Britain could not do without. Moving into the 1930s, Winston Churchill was no longer at the center of power in British politics. After many years holding important positions, he was gradually sidelined, holding no government office and having little direct influence on national decisions. This period is often called the wilderness years, the years of political isolation, where Churchill existed as a voice outside the system. To many of his contemporaries, this was the natural result of a career full of controversy. Previous decisions, from the Gallipoli campaign to economic and foreign policies that caused disagreement, made him a figure who could not be fully trusted. When new governments were formed, Churchill was no longer a preferred choice. While his position declined, the situation in Europe began to change in ways that few in Britain truly paid enough attention to. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party gradually consolidated power, turning a defeated nation after World War I into a rapidly rearming military power. Hitler's moves, withdrawing from international treaties, expanding the army, and step-by-step controlling Germany's entire political system, did not happen in secret, but in the context where many European countries were still haunted by the memory of the war that had just ended. Their priority was to avoid a new conflict at all costs. It was in this context that Churchill began issuing increasingly clear warnings about the danger from Nazi Germany. From the position of a backbench MP, he used speeches in Parliament, newspaper articles, and public forums to call on Britain to strengthen its defences, especially its air force. He argued that military cuts and reliance on international agreements were insufficient to deal with an opponent preparing for war. However, these arguments were not widely accepted. To many, Churchill was not a reliable warning voice, but a politician with outdated thinking, influenced by past conflicts and unable to adapt to a world trying to move toward peace. The reaction to Churchill in this period was not just indifference, but also included mockery. Some politicians and commentators saw him as a warmonger, always seeing the risk of war even when unnecessary. His views were tied to the image of a generation that had gone through World War I and had not escaped confrontational thinking. Meanwhile, the policy of appeasement, concession to maintain peace, was seen as the more reasonable choice. Agreements with Germany, including accepting some of Hitler's territorial demands, were believed by many to help stabilize Europe. In that environment, Churchill's voice became out of place. Churchill's political isolation in these years was not just about position, but also about influence. He had no decision-making power, no control over policy, and could not directly change the government's direction. The only thing he had was the ability to speak and persuade, tools that depended on whether others were willing to listen. In many cases, they were not. His speeches, though detailed and well-founded, often did not create immediate change. This created a prolonged tension. Churchill became more and more certain about the danger, while the environment around him reacted less and less. However, what is notable is that Churchill did not adjust his message to fit the majority. He did not tone down his warnings to avoid criticism, nor did he shift to less controversial topics. Instead, he continued to emphasize the same issue, repeating arguments about the need for military preparation and the danger of underestimating Nazi Germany. This showed a trait that had appeared earlier. He was willing to maintain a minority view if he believed it was right, even if it diminished his political standing. In his personal life, this period did not bring many positive changes in terms of reputation. Churchill continued to write books, give lectures, and maintain his intellectual activities, but these efforts were not enough to bring him back to the center of power. He lived in a state where he was both an experienced figure and someone without direct influence. This combination created a unique position. He could say things that those in government did not want or could not say, but at the same time he lacked the ability to turn those words into policy action. As events in Europe continued to unfold, the gap between what Churchill warned about and what was actually happening began to narrow. Germany's reoccupation of the Rhineland, annexation of Austria, and later demands on Czechoslovakia showed a clear trend. Each of Hitler's moves weakened international agreements and shifted the balance of power. However, the response from Britain and other countries remained cautious, with the hope that concessions could prevent a larger war. In that context, Churchill's position became particularly distinctive. He was not the only one who recognized the danger, but he was one of the few who persistently spoke about it publicly and consistently. This did not immediately change how he was perceived, but it began to create a small shift in how some people evaluated his warnings. Even so, by the end of the 1930s, Churchill had still not returned to power, and much of Britain's policy still did not reflect his views. These years brought no victory or recognition, but they made one thing clear. Churchill had grown accustomed to standing alone in his decisions and positions. When there was no widespread support, he still maintained his viewpoint. When seen as outdated, he did not change to fit the trend, and as a threat he spoke of became increasingly obvious, the gap between his isolation and external reality began to narrow. But at that point, nothing yet guaranteed that his warnings would turn into action. The only certainty was that the situation in Europe was moving closer to a point where options would no longer be plentiful, and when that happened, voices once ignored might become more important than ever. While Winston Churchill's warnings had still not been turned into action, Europe entered a phase where the policy of appeasement, concession to maintain peace, became the dominant choice for many governments. For leaders in Britain and France, the memory of World War I was still too vivid, and the top priority was to avoid repeating a full-scale conflict. In that context, Adolf Hitler's moves were not met with direct resistance, but with efforts at negotiation and concession, in the hope that each compromise would delay or prevent war. This process unfolded step by step. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but faced no military response from the European powers. 2 years later, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, continuing to expand its territory without significant intervention. The peak of appeasement was clearly shown in the Munich Agreement of 1938, when Britain and France accepted Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, believing it would secure peace for our time. These decisions not only reflected caution, but also showed the extent of willingness to concede to avoid direct confrontation. Throughout that process, Churchill continued to issue warnings, but his position did not change significantly. He held no government office and had no power to shape foreign policy. His speeches in Parliament and public writings became increasingly direct, focusing on pointing out that each concession did not reduce the risk of war, but instead enabled Germany to consolidate its strength. However, to many, this argument was still not convincing enough to change the chosen course. Churchill was still seen as a pessimist, someone viewing the situation in an extreme way and not reflecting society's general desire to maintain peace. This dismissal came not only from the leadership, but also from parts of the public. After the heavy losses of the previous war, the idea of rearmament in preparation for a new conflict did not receive widespread support. In that environment, Churchill's voice, though consistent, remained a minority one. He faced not only disagreement on views, but also a social context unwilling to accept what he was saying. However, as events continued, the gap between policy and reality narrowed further. After Munich, Germany did not stop. Instead of consolidating peace, the previous concessions seemed to have increased Hitler's confidence. In early 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, an action that clearly showed prior commitments had no binding value. This was a crucial turning point, when some leaders began to realize that appeasement was not achieving its intended goal. However, at that moment, the ability to adjust had already been limited by what had happened before. For Churchill, this period further reinforced his position as a lone voice. He was not the only one to change his views as the situation worsened, but he was one of the few who had maintained his stance from the beginning. This began to create a shift in how some people evaluated him. Warnings once seen as exaggerated were now re-examined in the new context. However, this change did not happen immediately and was not enough to bring him back to a position of power. Tensions in Europe continued to rise, not only militarily, but also politically. Countries began to reconsider their strategies, but there was not much time left to make major adjustments. When Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in August 1939, another important factor was removed from the equation, paving the way for the next steps. Just a few weeks later, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France were forced to declare war. War, the very thing Churchill had warned about for many years, became reality. Throughout this entire process, Churchill's role was not that of a decision-maker, but of an observer and warner. He did not control policy, but he recorded the development of the situation and continuously emphasized the possible consequences. This created a form of indirect influence. Even though he could not change decisions immediately, he helped shape how some people understood what was happening. When the war began, views once considered marginal started to be re-examined in an entirely different context. At the moment war officially broke out, Churchill was still not in the highest leadership position. However, the combination of his experience, steadfastness in his stance, and the way his warnings gradually aligned with reality created a foundation for the changes that followed. The years of being ignored did not bring power, but they shaped how he was perceived when the situation changed. As options became limited and the need for a different approach became clearer, the traits that once made him doubted his toughness, directness, and unwillingness to compromise began to be seen as necessary elements. Tension was no longer an abstract concept, but became a tangible reality. Countries were no longer talking about the possibility of war, but were in war. The decisions made in the preceding years now fully revealed their consequences. And as the world entered a phase where choices grew increasingly narrow, the role of those willing to make decisions under uncertainty became more important than ever. What had once been warnings now became the foundation for action, and the storm Churchill had spoken of for many years finally began to erupt. When war officially broke out after the invasion of Poland, Britain entered a phase where strategic options gradually became limited. By 1940, the situation was no longer prediction or warning, but a series of real failures on the battlefield. The German army advanced rapidly through Western Europe at a speed many military planners had not anticipated. Norway fell. The Netherlands and Belgium collapsed in a short time. And as France, Britain's largest ally on the continent, faced the risk of defeat, the entire European defense structure disintegrated. Britain not only lost its strategic position, but also its important protective buffer. In a very short time, the nation shifted from being part of an alliance to being almost alone. In that context, political pressure in London mounted rapidly. The government of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, which had been closely tied to the previous appeasement policy, faced growing criticism. The military failures not only weakened Britain's position in Europe, but also eroded trust in the current leadership. Internal discussions began to revolve around a question that could no longer be delayed: who would lead Britain in the next phase of the war? Among the names considered, Winston Churchill was not the obvious choice. He had returned to government as First Lord of the Admiralty when the war began. But his reputation remained two-sided. Supporters saw in him steadfastness and the ability to act in crisis. Skeptics still remembered his controversial decisions in the past, especially the Gallipoli campaign. However, as other options were gradually eliminated due to lack of consensus, Churchill became an acceptable alternative in a situation where no option was completely safe. In May 1940, Churchill was appointed Prime Minister. The transfer of power took place in an emergency context, not as a new beginning, but as a response to the worsening situation. From the very first days, he faced a deeply divided government. Some cabinet members, including those with significant influence, believed that continuing the war under the current conditions was unrealistic. They argued that Britain should consider negotiating with Adolf Hitler through intermediaries, with the goal of reaching an agreement that could preserve some degree of sovereignty. These arguments were not without basis. British forces were withdrawing from the continent in the Dunkirk operation, a large-scale but defensive evacuation. The German Air Force was preparing attacks on British territory, and the possibility of invasion was no longer a distant hypothesis. In that context, the idea of negotiation was seen as a way to avoid a worse outcome. For many, this was not surrender but a strategic adjustment. Churchill did not agree with this approach. His viewpoint was based not only on military assessment, but also on his understanding of the enemy's nature. He believed that any agreement with Hitler would not bring long-term stability, but would only delay an inevitable outcome. More importantly, he argued that accepting negotiations at that moment would weaken the nation's morale and destroy its future capacity to resist. For Churchill, the issue was not just victory or defeat on the battlefield. but maintaining the will to keep fighting. In cabinet meetings, Churchill argued directly. He did not deny the difficulties Britain faced, but he refused to accept that those difficulties led to seeking a deal with Germany. He emphasized that if Britain continued to fight, there was still the possibility of receiving support from other nations, especially the United States. Conversely, if Britain negotiated and accepted the enemy's terms, that possibility would vanish. This was not a decision based on certainty, but a choice between two paths, both carrying great risk. Ultimately, Churchill made a clear decision. Britain would not surrender and would not seek a peace agreement under the current conditions. This decision did not end the debate, but shaped the government's direction. It shifted the focus from seeking short-term solutions to preparing for a prolonged war. In that context, another factor became crucial: the ability to maintain the people's morale. Churchill understood that war was not decided solely by military force, but also by the will of society. His speeches in this period were not simply policy announcements, but tools to shape how people understood the situation. In his first speech as Prime Minister, he did not promise quick victory, but spoke of blood, toil, tears and sweat, a realistic description of what lay ahead. In subsequent speeches, he continued to emphasize that Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, not as a slogan but as a commitment to the nation's course. These words did not immediately change the military situation, but they began to create a shift in how people viewed the war. Instead of focusing on the possibility of failure, the emphasis moved to maintaining resistance. This did not eliminate fear, but provided a framework to confront it. In a moment when many factors were beyond control, the ability to control the response became a critical element. However, the decision not to surrender brought no guarantees. The military reality did not change immediately. Britain still faced the risk of direct attack. Resources remained limited, and the outcome of the war was still unclear. What Churchill offered was not a certain solution, but a direction based on the belief that continuing to fight held more meaning than seeking a deal under unfavorable conditions. In that context, the question was no longer whether Churchill's decision was right in principle, but whether it could lead to a feasible outcome. If Britain could endure long enough, if international conditions shifted in a favorable direction, then this decision might be seen as a turning point. But if those conditions did not materialize, if Britain could not sustain resistance, the consequences would not be just military defeat, but the end of a political and social system that had existed for centuries. The decision had been made, but its outcome remained entirely undetermined. Winston Churchill's decision not to surrender was quickly tested by harsh reality. When Germany's plan for a direct invasion could not be implemented immediately, the strategy shifted to another form: aerial attack aimed at weakening Britain's will. Starting in the fall of 1940, the Blitz became a prolonged bombing campaign focused on London and major industrial cities. The goal was not only to destroy infrastructure, but also to paralyze civilian morale, forcing the British government to reconsider continuing the war. In the first weeks, air raids occurred continuously at night. Air raid sirens, searchlights sweeping the sky, and the sound of exploding bombs became part of daily life. London, the political and economic center of Britain, bore the direct impact. Many residential areas were destroyed, historic buildings damaged, and transportation systems disrupted. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands injured or left homeless. The familiar urban landscape changed rapidly, and the sense of safety nearly vanished. For civilians, war was no longer a distant concept but a direct experience. Each night, they descended into shelters, carrying essential items, waiting for the raids to end. Families were separated, children evacuated from cities, and communities adapted to a new rhythm where uncertainty became normal. Losses were measured not just in casualties but in changes to social structure and psychology. Fatigue, anxiety, and uncertainty accumulated over time, raising a crucial question: how long could Britain sustain its will under these conditions? In that context, Churchill's role extended beyond making policy decisions to maintaining the nation's mental stability. He did not retreat to safe bunkers but frequently appeared in bombed areas, walking through destroyed streets, meeting civilians and rescue workers. These visits did not reduce material damage, but affected how people perceived the situation. The image of a prime minister present at the scene, sharing space with those directly affected, created a form of connection between leader and society. Parallel to his physical presence was the use of speeches as a strategic tool. Churchill continued addressing Parliament and the public, not shying away from the difficulties Britain faced. He described the situation directly but placed it in a broader frame, where the war was understood as part of a longer process. These speeches did not provide immediate solutions, but helped shape how people interpreted what was happening. Instead of seeing the air raids as signs of impending defeat, they were placed in the context of an ongoing resistance. This approach had a cumulative impact. While the bombing continued to cause damage, society's ability to keep functioning was not completely broken. Essential services were maintained, government agencies continued operating, and air defenses gradually improved their response capability. The Royal Air Force, RAF, played a crucial role in limiting the effectiveness of the attacks, especially in daytime air battles. Though the threat was not eliminated, these efforts helped create a sense that the war was not entirely out of control. Churchill's image in this period gradually became tied to the concept of resilience. He was not the one directly commanding every battle, but the one shaping how Britain responded to pressure. His steadfast message that continuing to fight was necessary and meaningful was repeated through various channels. This did not eliminate opposing views, but reduced their chance of becoming the dominant trend. However, it must be noted that the Blitz spirit was not a uniform state. Alongside expressions of unity and resilience, fatigue, doubt, and anxiety still existed. Not everyone reacted the same way, and there was not always absolute consensus on the war's direction. These differences were part of wartime social reality and were not completely erased by official messages. Throughout the Blitz, the ultimate outcome of the war remained unclear. The air raids did not achieve the goal of breaking Britain's will, but they also did not end the threat. The risk of invasion still existed, and the war continued on multiple fronts. What changed was how Britain faced the situation, from passive reaction to active adaptation, where continuing to function became part of the overall strategy. For Churchill, this period reinforced his position as a central figure in maintaining national stability. The high-risk decision not to surrender began to be viewed in a new context, where continuing to fight was no longer a single choice but an ongoing process. However, this reinforcement did not mean the risks had disappeared. The war continued, and the challenges ahead remained unresolved. In that context, the dominant emotion was not victory but a balance between hope and reality. Hope stemmed from Britain still standing firm, still maintaining operations, and still possessing the capacity to resist. Reality was that losses continued, and the final outcome was still undetermined. It was this combination, neither collapsing nor yet victorious, that shaped Britain's experience in this period and laid the foundation for the war's subsequent developments. After Britain endured the most intense phase of the Blitz, it became clear that the war could not be won through will and single-handed defense alone. Churchill understood that to survive and move toward counterattack, Britain needed more than internal resources. It needed a strong enough alliance network to counterbalance the expanding power of Nazi Germany. In that context, international relations became a decisive factor, not only militarily but also for long-term strategy. The most important among them was the relationship with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Before the United States officially entered the war, Churchill proactively built a personal and political connection with the American president. The two exchanged letters regularly, discussing the war situation and possibilities for support. Roosevelt, though constrained by domestic neutrality policies, gradually expanded assistance through the Lend-Lease program, supplying weapons, warships, and resources to Britain. This was not an official alliance at first, but a strategic step that helped Britain maintain its fighting capacity during the most difficult period. When the United States officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, this relationship shifted from indirect support to full cooperation. Churchill and Roosevelt coordinated in high-level conferences, shaping the overall strategy for the European front and other regions. However, this cooperation was not entirely balanced. Britain, though an ally, and to adapt to the increasingly dominant role of the United States, a superpower with vastly superior resources. Churchill had to adjust his approach, both maintaining Britain's influence and ensuring that joint decisions did not undermine the nation's long-term interests. Parallel to that was a far more complex relationship, the alliance with Joseph Stalin. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, an ideological adversary became a military ally. Churchill, who had previously opposed Bolshevism, was forced to accept the reality that the Soviet Union was an indispensable part of the effort against Hitler. He famously said that if Hitler invaded hell, he would make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons, an expression that showed the level of flexibility the situation demanded. The alliance with the Soviet Union had clear strategic value. The Eastern Front forced Germany to divide its forces, reducing pressure on other areas. However, it also posed challenges in trust and coordination. Churchill had to work with a leader whose political system and methods of operation were completely different, while still maintaining consistency in the common goal. Conferences between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were not only places to plan strategy, but also arenas to negotiate influence, territory, and the post-war order. While the alliances strengthened the military position, they also brought difficult moral decisions. One of the most controversial issues was the strategy of bombing enemy cities. Air campaigns targeting Germany's industrial centers and urban areas were carried out with the goal of weakening war production capacity, but they also caused massive civilian casualties. These decisions were not made lightly, but in the context of total war, where the line between military and civilian targets became blurred. Another example of moral pressure was the Bengal famine of 1943, which occurred while India remained a British colony. Millions died from food shortages while resources were diverted to the war effort. Decisions about transportation and food distribution became highly controversial, raising questions about how the British government balanced war needs with responsibility toward territories under its administration. Churchill's role in this matter continues to be debated, reflecting the complexity of decision-making under global emergency conditions. The pressures of war came not only from battles but also from maintaining a diverse and sometimes conflicting alliance system. Churchill had to constantly adjust between priorities, supporting the Soviet Union to keep the Eastern Front active, coordinating with the United States to prepare major campaigns in Europe, and at the same time protecting Britain's interests in a rapidly changing world. Every decision carried consequences, not just in the present, but in the structure of the post-war international order. In that process, a central conflict became clear, the goal of victory and the price to be paid. Churchill believed that defeating Nazi Germany was the prerequisite, but the path to that goal was not always aligned with ideal moral standards. Choosing between imperfect options became part of leadership. No choice was entirely right or entirely wrong, only decisions made with limited information and time. For Churchill, this period was not just about coordinating the war, but about continuously balancing competing elements. He faced not only external enemies, but also the limitations of the system he led. Alliances brought strength, but reduced absolute control. Military decisions brought strategic advantages, but came with humanitarian consequences. And in every case, he had to make choices without guarantees of the outcome. As the war continued to expand, Churchill's role became tied to his ability to navigate these contradictions. He could not eliminate them, but could only manage them to an acceptable degree. This created a complex image, a leader steadfast in his goal but flexible in method, a pursuer of victory who could not avoid controversial decisions. In the context of global war, the balance between strategy and morality was not a stable state, but a continuous process, where every step shaped not only the war's outcome, but also how it would be viewed afterward. As the fronts gradually closed and Allied forces advanced deep into German territory, the war's outcome became clearer than ever. After years of global combat, the system Adolf Hitler built began to collapse from within. Major German cities were surrounded, resources depleted, and resistance capability diminished. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally, officially ending the war in Europe. For Britain, this was the moment when years of endurance from the Blitz to prolonged campaigns on multiple fronts finally led to the result Churchill had persistently pursued: victory. In that moment, Churchill became a clear symbol of resilience and resistance. His image was tied to the difficult decisions of 1940, to the speeches that shaped national spirit, and to maintaining a course when options seemed exhausted. For many British people, he was not just the Prime Minister, but the embodiment of a historical period when the nation stood firm against the greatest pressure. When victory was announced, the streets of London and many other cities filled with people. They gathered, celebrated, shared a sense of relief after years of living in uncertainty. Flags were hung everywhere, cheers rang out, and the general atmosphere was one of release after prolonged tension. Churchill appeared before the public in those days as a central figure of the victory. He gave speeches, met with people, and participated in symbolic activities of that historic moment. However, even in these moments, political reality did not fully align with the general emotion. The war in Europe ended, but Britain's internal problems did not disappear. The economy was weakened after years of war. The social system faced great pressure, and the need for reform became clearer. Just a few months after victory was declared, Britain held a general election. This was a normal step in a democratic political system, but in the context of having just gone through war, it carried special meaning. Churchill, as the wartime leader, was seen by many as a strong candidate. However, the election campaign was not only about the past, but also about the future. People did not only judge his role in the war, but also considered who could address the economic and social issues in peacetime. The election result was not what many predicted. Churchill's Conservative Party lost, and he lost the position of Prime Minister. This transition happened quickly, only a short time after the war ended in Europe. For Churchill, this was not just a change in position, but a shift from the center of power back to the political margins once again. For the public, it was a decision reflecting the difference between wartime needs and peacetime needs. The contrast between these two periods was very clear. In war, Churchill was judged on his ability to lead in crisis, make quick decisions, and sustain national morale. In peacetime, the criteria changed. People cared more about social welfare, employment, and national reconstruction. The qualities that made Churchill successful in war were not entirely suited to the expectations of the new phase. This did not diminish his role in the victory, but changed how he was perceived in the present. On a personal level, this transition created a complex state. Churchill remained a respected figure, still recognized for his wartime contributions, but no longer held direct power. He was not completely removed from political life, but his role changed. From a decision-maker, he became an observer and participant from a different position. This was not the first time he experienced such a change, but the context this time was different. It came right after the peak of his career. The dominant emotion of this period was therefore two-sided. On one hand was victory, a result pursued for many years and achieved at great cost. On the other hand, was incompleteness when national success did not mean continuation of personal success. Churchill did not fail in his greatest objective, but he did not continue to hold the leadership role after that objective was achieved. This combination reflected a broader feature of politics and history. Different periods require different types of leadership. A person may be suited to one circumstance but not another. In Churchill's case, he was the right person for the moment when Britain needed steadfastness and the ability to face crisis. When circumstances changed, the political system adjusted accordingly. However, this did not erase his influence. The decisions made during the war continued to shape Britain's position in the post-war world. Alliances were built, strategies were implemented, and the way Britain faced crisis became part of a lasting legacy. Churchill, even without being Prime Minister, remained a voice with influence in international affairs. Victory, therefore, was not a simple endpoint but a turning point. It closed one historical period but opened another with new challenges. For Churchill, this was the moment when two currents, glory and change, intersected. He achieved the goal he had persistently pursued, but he did not continue to hold the position to shape what came after. And in that intersection, his image became more complex, not only the leader of victory, but also an individual facing the reality that victory does not always bring continuation. After leaving the position of Prime Minister, right after the victory, Winston Churchill did not disappear from political life, but his role changed markedly. He entered a period where his voice was no longer tied to direct power, but to the ability to shape how the world understood a new order forming. In 1946, in a speech in the United States, he used the phrase Iron Curtain to describe the division emerging in Europe, an invisible but increasingly clear boundary between the areas controlled by the Soviet Union and the rest of the continent. This speech was not just a political observation, but became a landmark opening the way the West viewed the Cold War. Churchill was once again in a familiar position, the warner of a danger that not everyone was ready to acknowledge. In the years that followed, he continued to be active in politics as the leader of the opposition, maintaining influence through speeches and views on foreign policy. By 1951, Churchill returned to the position of Prime Minister, a comeback showing he remained a heavyweight figure in the British political system. However, the circumstances this time were significantly different from 1940. Britain was no longer in a state of total war, and domestic issues, economy, social welfare, reconstruction became the focus. Churchill, now older and with a long history of upheavals, had to lead in an environment less urgent, but no less complex. This return did not last long in the way he had experienced during the war. The biggest problem did not come from political opponents, but from his own body. Churchill's health began to decline noticeably. In 1953, he suffered a serious stroke that affected his ability to work and communicate. Though this information was not made public immediately, those inside the government noticed the change. His concentration decreased, the speed of handling work slowed, and signs of fatigue appeared more frequently. This was no longer the Churchill of the 1940s, who could work continuously under high pressure, but a leader facing the limits of age. In this period, the way he participated in government work changed. He still held the role of Prime Minister, but relied much more on his associates. Important decisions were still made, but the process of preparation and execution became more distributed. Churchill no longer appeared with the same frequency and intensity as before. His speeches became fewer and each appearance was carefully considered. His public image began to reflect this change, still a figure of prestige, but no longer carrying the energy and sharpness of wartime. Churchill's personal life also slowed down. He devoted more time to writing and painting activities that had once helped him find balance during difficult periods before. His family, especially Clementine, continued to play an important role in maintaining stability. However, the pace of life was no longer completely dominated by political work. Instead, there was a shift to a state where he was both a public figure and an individual, gradually stepping back from the center. Facing old age was not just a physical issue, but also one of perception about legacy. Churchill had gone through many phases in his career, from failures, isolation, to the peak during the war and the return afterward. At this point, the question was no longer what he would do next, but how what he had done would be viewed. He continued writing about the history of the war, not just as a participant, but as someone who wanted to record and shape how the story was told. This work was not only academic, but also part of building his personal legacy. However, Churchill's image in this period was two-sided. On one hand, he was still respected as one of the most important leaders of the 20th century. On the other hand, the decline in health and the gradual reduction in public activity created another image, a human being unable to escape the laws of time. Those who once saw him as a symbol of strength now witnessed a different version, less energetic, more dependent, and clearly approaching the final phase of his career. In 1955, Churchill officially resigned as Prime Minister, closing the second and final time he held that position. This decision was not surprising, but seen as a necessary step given his health and age. After leaving office, he did not completely withdraw from public life, but his level of involvement decreased significantly. Appearances became rarer, and his role shifted to being more symbolic than practical. This period lacked the dramatic events of before, but carried a different kind of tension, the transition from action to reflection, from direct influence to indirect influence. Churchill was no longer in the position to make decisions shaping history in real time, but became part of that history itself. He had to face the reality that what he could do had reached its limit, and the rest lay in the hands of other generations. In the silence after the storm, Churchill's image did not disappear but changed. He was no longer the one standing in the midst of crisis, but the one looking back on it. No longer the center of decisions, but a symbol of a past era. And in that change there was a kind of ending that was not abrupt but gradual, where a figure who once shaped events had to accept that events continued without depending on him. From a boy who grew up feeling abandoned, a politician once sidelined and seen as outdated, Winston Churchill traveled a journey where each phase was tied to isolation before leading to leadership. He was not the obvious choice when Britain faced crisis, but precisely in the moment when options became most limited, he rose and shaped the nation's direction. When Adolf Hitler expanded power across Europe, Churchill was one of the few voices persistently warning, and later the one who refused to compromise when that decision was a matter of survival. His role in sustaining Britain's resistance not only influenced the outcome of World War II, but also helped shape the post-war international order. However, Churchill's journey was not just a story of victory. He was also a controversial figure, with decisions and policies that continue to be analyzed and debated, from military campaigns with heavy losses like the Gallipoli campaign, to wartime choices involving bombing and colonial management. His image was not entirely consistent. To some, he was a symbol of resilience and courage in the hardest times. To others, he was a pragmatic leader willing to accept great costs to achieve strategic goals. These two views do not exclude each other but coexist in how Churchill is remembered. He was both the man who stood alone in critical moments and the one who had to make decisions under imperfect conditions. His legacy therefore lies not only in what he did, but also in how those actions continue to influence how the modern world understands leadership, war, and responsibility. In a world still facing crises and difficult choices, Churchill's story remains a point of reference. But the final question lingers: was he the one who shaped history, or a product of the very circumstances that created him? The story of Winston Churchill shows that leadership is not a straight upward path but a series of failures, isolation, and difficult decisions in uncertain times. When he was sidelined in the 1930s, persistently warning about the danger from Adolf Hitler, but mocked, it was a lesson in daring to hold firm to a view even when the majority disagreed. When he became Prime Minister in 1940 and refused to negotiate though Britain faced collapse, it was proof that sometimes leadership demands choosing between what is right and what is easy. His speeches during the Blitz did not change the reality of bombs and fire, but sustained national spirit, a clear lesson that words, if timely and right, can become strategic power. However, the story does not glorify him. From the disaster of the Gallipoli campaign to controversies over wartime decisions, Churchill showed that the cost of action can sometimes be very high and mistakes unavoidable. For the American people, in a society that values individualism and freedom, the lesson here is not only resilience, but also the responsibility that comes with power and choice. An effective leader is not one who is always right, but one who dares to take responsibility, dares to stand alone when necessary, and continues to act even without guarantees of the outcome. If you want to continue exploring stories of people who stood alone against history and made decisions that changed the world, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video where we will continue to dive into the hidden sides behind the most powerful figures of the century.